At the Cape we have generations of people gone from one generation to another who've had these experiences. How has that affected people? We need to look at this. We need to know why there's so much crime here, why our prisons are so full. You know, we need to look at history.
I don't want to create a sort of victimology, because I try to emphasize what slaves achieved despite the adversity. But when we're talking about gender, we're talking about very deeply ingrained attitudes.
To think very deeply and critically about the ways in which what appears to us completely normal has already been shaped, by these same anxieties and assumptions.
First of all, you have the educational system under colonialism and then under apartheid, which simply brushed away the question of slavery. They just weren't mentioned. In my view, it is murdering memory. The biggest part of the population at the Cape were slaves. That's one aspect of the erasure from the record. The second is the guilt.
The economy at the Cape was based on slavery.
There is in fact a significant inability on the part, certainly of dominant culture, but also of the descendants of enslaved people to look directly at this period. This has to do with the legacy of the overwhelming brutality of that period, which was marked not only by spectacular uses of violent retribution and punishment to ensure a level of terrified obeisance, also the high proportion of male slaves in relation to male settlers generated an intense anxiety about the proximity and the potential for insurrection on the part of enslaved people. So this is part of the reality, and how we remember that reality is marked by a distorted archive, but also by a distorted set of public themes and debates on and images about the past.
I think for many years there was this absolute amnesia, and people were born into an identity that was constructed as coloured, and it created a kind of class consciousness where coloured was something less than.
There were several types of hierarchy. The person at the top of the lodge hierarchy was the translator who would go along with the Dutch on their slaving expeditions to Madagascar and to the east coast of Africa. Through him, they could trade for slaves. But when they were not trading, he lived in the lodge and enjoyed a whole lot of prerequisites. That was a linguistic hierarchy. Then the administrative hierarchy, who was in charge at the top, was a mandoer, and we still have the word today, who was like an overseer. On the gender side of the hierarchy, the person at the top was called the matresse, the matron of the lodge. And she was literate, taught in the lodge school, and had jurisdiction over the women in the lodge. The regional hierarchy, slaves in the lodge came from 4 regions: India and Sri Lanka, Madagascar, and the east coast of Africa, and in the beginning even from the west coast of Africa, and of course Indonesia. At the top of that racial hierarchy were half-castes, who were called castis, and then right at the bottom were the Mozambican slaves, who were kept in the basement. So their position on the hierarchy mirrored their architectural position in the lodge. They were underneath everybody else.
Just as history has been foundational in ensuring that we attend to slavery at all and give it the necessary attention it deserves, its very methodology has also, and its concentrated and narrow audience has also limited the broader public debate on slavery. And this is where the work of the imagination is really crucial.
Dina, who was part of the Runaway gang, which ended up in Clip. And for a woman slave to run away, and especially a woman slave with a child to run away, put her into an extremely vulnerable position. She could be raped. The child was absolutely dependent on the mother. Her situation was far worse than a single male running into the arid landscape. Many of the runaways, when they were brought before the court, would say they were trying to get back to Angola, even though they were traveling in an easterly direction, or they were trying to go to Madagascar and traveling into Angola. So there was a complete mix-up of geography. They were brought on board ship. All they knew about was the distance and the time taken, and then they were deposited at the Cape. They were invariably caught in the interior. Why? Because they couldn't survive in the arid landscape. They didn't know the language. They didn't know the culture. They simply ran out of options. Food might be very scarce, couldn't find any water. And there are many sad stories of runaway slaves who didn't make it into the interior and were found later just dead bodies and skeletons. So for a woman slave to run away was, first of all, very rare. But it was rare because women were very much more dependent on the patriarch, the owner, for their sustenance, for the welfare of their children. Very strong reasons undergirded her decision to run away.
A slave woman was never raped. It was because her body didn't belong to her.
Enslaved women were subjected to enforced prostitution. They were also blamed for sexual perversity and inviting sexual violence.
Dina, the runaway, ended up in Clip, and instead of being punished for running away, she was punished for providing sexual service, for prostitution, in other words.
In the entire period of 176 years of slavery at the Cape, not a single man was ever convicted of the rape of a slave woman. In other words, not a free man and not an enslaved man. So sexual violence against enslaved and serfed women was carried out with impunity.
Racial hierarchies were always there, and whiteness always stood as the kind of top of the measuring post of where you stood and how much social value you had.
More than a century and a half of violence that was built into the experience of being black and a woman led as well, I think, to very pressured and distorted set of ideas of masculinity and femininity and this sexuality of black and white women and men.
And these were people who were carrying it from one generation to another.
How one survives physically and psychically might very well include ways of negotiating forms of survival that were not only and clearly were also about resistance, but did not take a form of resistance that only were about fighting back heroically, but that we must think very carefully about simply dismissing as complicity or inviting or living with easily sexual violence.
What happens to you in your mind? What does that do to you, and how does that affect your kind of life?
And how do we think about that reality so that we don't replicate unintentionally exactly some of the ideas about sexuality that continue to place a daunting burden on the descendants of enslaved people and also on the descendants of those people who were slave owners.
How could she have even contextualized what it was to have been ill-treated?
When we're thinking about portraying enslaved people, my own approach is not to seek redemptive images, not to seek appealing images, and to seek, in fact, complexity in the historical record.
You can't give agency to somebody. Agency is something you have or you don't have. It's not something for a historian to bestow upon his subject.
To face the intellectual and political and ethical challenge of a past that is under-discussed.
When you talk about achievement in a slave society, you're talking about the enormous obstacles that they had to achieve anything.